All right, the next section you guys read was chapter 27, section 2, and it contained 3 different pieces of reading. And switching gears from the annexation of Hawaii, we're looking towards Cuba and the Spanish-American War, although Hawaii will come up. So in 1895, Cubans were revolting against the Spanish. So Spain controlled Cuba. At this point, and Spain was one of the big empires, although by the late 1800s, their empire is starting to dwindle, and we'll see that has an impact in the Spanish-American War that we'll see. So these Cuban, what became known as insurrectos, the ones who were revolting, revolted against their Spanish overlords on sugar plantations. They used the scorched earth policy. So as the Spanish were attacking and they were retreating, they would burn the earth behind them so that the Spanish crops were destroyed. And so you see that depicted there in the picture. The U.S. Was sitting obviously not too far, about 90 miles away from the coast of Cuba, and they were rooting for the Cubans, and there are several reasons why. One, the Cuban story reflected that was similar to what the United States experienced with our revolution. We were fighting our big imperial brother in Great Britain. And so the Americans felt kind of a connection with Cuba for that reason. We liked the idea of liberty, independence, self-determination. Yellow journalism was another reason. There were newspaper reports that in many cases were fabricated or did not tell the entire story, which made the Spanish appear worse than they were. And I'm not saying the Spanish were good, but there were some fabrications that were taking place in the newspapers that would turn the American public even more so against the Spanish. The Monroe Doctrine, the idea that the United States would control the Western Hemisphere and Europe could stay out of it. Well, this played into that idea. And then the eventual desire to gain a foothold in the Gulf of Mexico and Panama Canal. It was viewed as though Cuba would be a gateway to the Caribbean. I forgot the picture of the dogs in the hammock. It's kind of a long story, but I do a kind of a back to school thing to put people in a good mood that we skipped this year because of virtual learning, but it involved the idea of if you think positively, you perform better. We might do something with that eventually. So you might actually see some baby animals in these slides. If you see them, enjoy them. So as the Cubans are rising in revolt, Spain tries to suppress the revolt, and so they send in a Spanish general who became known as Butcher Whaler to suppress the revolt. And his method of suppression was to be harsh, and so he started prison camps that were known as reconcentration camps, somewhat similar to what you saw in World War II with the Germans, without the mass extermination, but in terms of conditions. And so many people did die because of those unsanitary conditions. This also allowed the yellow press to run with these stories. And so this is where some of the stretching of the truth took place. Your textbook tells a story of some Spanish guards strip searching women, and there were guards that strip search women, but they were female guards. And so again, the pictures depicted in the newspapers were put there to rile up Americans. Actually, they were put there to sell newspapers, but newspapers would sell more if people were riled up about it. And so there's this famous quote by William Randolph Hearst that he sent a photographer and artist down to Cuba and said, "You furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war." So basically, you give me some pictures and I'll paint a story around it. I'll put a story behind it that will develop a war. It is a quote attributed to William Randolph Hearst. From what I've read in other history books, he didn't actually say it, but it makes for a good story, as many things do in history. And so pictured there, you see one example of one of the images used in newspapers to provoke Americans to want to fight the Spanish. And then this is that Spanish general, Butcher Whaler, who I also believe is one of the identification terms on your ID list. Another thing led the United States to want to get involved, and that was the Loam letter. So a Spanish representative deployed to Loam, sent a letter home from DC to Spain that was intercepted and publicized, that was criticizing President McKinley. Now, the American public didn't have an issue themselves criticizing McKinley, but it was kind of that idea of he's our president, we can criticize him, but someone from another country should not be doing that. And so that riled up the Americans. But the big event was the explosion of the USS Maine. So the USS Maine had been parked in Havana Harbor as kind of a sign of America's presence in the region, and it exploded. And so the assumption was that a Spanish mine had led to the explosion. And so the newspapers and then eventually the American public and government ran with the story. And so the war cry became, to hell with Spain, remember the Maine. And so there were actually investigations later that came out and determined that it was not a Spanish mine. It was an explosion, ignition explosion on board is why the Maine exploded. But for 1898, that didn't matter. So because of all of these factors culminating with the explosion of the Maine, McKinley does give in and sends a message asking for war to Congress. McKinley had this back and forth battle because ultimately Spain had done what he'd asked. They'd ended the reconcentration camps, and they had stopped fighting the insurrectos. But he was already far down the path and didn't want to seem indecisive to the American public in an election, with an election cycle coming up. And so he sent Congress a message asking for war, and they granted that on April 11th, 1898. So the official beginning of the Spanish-American War is April 11th, 1898. And with the passing of the declaration of war, the United States also signed the Teller Amendment. And this is important because it stated that the United States would give Cuba its freedom after Spain was out. So this was very different than what other imperial or colonial powers had done. We are saying we are going to remove Spain and then leave Cuba on their own to be independent. The other European nations were skeptical of this with good reason. And so we'll see what happens if the United States upholds this Teller Amendment at the conclusion of the war. And so this becomes known as the Spanish-American War. So it's a war between Spain and the United States that's fought in Cuba. So when we're talking about the fighting, it took place mostly in Cuba. There's actually fighting that takes place in the Philippines as well. So don't be too confused by the name. It's the Spanish-American War because it is between Spain and the US, but fighting takes place not in Spain or the United States. The fighting takes place in Cuba and the Philippines. Before the war is actually declared, Theodore Roosevelt, who is Assistant Secretary of the Navy, actually orders a fleet of ships led by Commodore George Dewey to move to the Philippines. And the Philippines are involved because it is another piece of the Spanish Empire. So we're going to attack their entire empire, not just Cuba. So Dewey does this, and he arrives and is able to successfully have success in Manila Bay on May 1st, 1898, but then he's just stuck out there because he doesn't have reinforcements coming to take over the control of the entire island. So America's new ships defeat the Spanish ships in the Philippines fairly easily. This is kind of what I just highlighted. Dewey won the battle but couldn't take the island with just the soldiers he had. Foot soldiers do eventually arrive in August, so Dewey's just out there chilling for a few months, and troops finally arrive and they do take control of the Philippines. And now that we have the Philippines, and if I had a map here, I'd point it out to you where the Philippines is, but Hawaii, it comes back up as a potential stopping point in between mainland United States and the Philippines. And so what we talked about in the last week with the annexation of Hawaii, where we started the process in 1893, but then we stopped. McKinley finalizes that in 1898. And so Hawaii becomes under U.S. control July 7th, 1898. And the Science of Happiness says a baby animal will make you happy. So there's a baby giraffe there for you. So now for the attack on Cuba. Americans have not fought a war like this, so they're ill prepared. They have clothing that's equipped for winter weather. It never feels like winter in Cuba, and so their clothing for sub-zero temps is not appropriate. There's disorganization on the beaches in Tampa Bay where they're going to launch their vessels to go to Cuba. The U.S. troops are led by General William Shafter. Your textbook talks about how he strategically may have been a good general, but he was ill-equipped for the landscape and climate of Cuba. He was morbidly obese, and in fact, he had gout and had to eventually be carried around on the back of a door throughout the fighting in Cuba because he couldn't walk the terrain. Theodore Roosevelt, who we've mentioned before and will continue to mention a lot, or he's no longer Assistant Secretary of the Navy. At this point, he took on the role of organizer of the Rough Riders, where he is it's this group of guys from all walks of life who kind of just want adventure. And so they're a volunteer group who decides to go to Cuba and fight against the Spanish. And you can see Roosevelt pictured there right in the center, a really famous picture, well before he becomes president or does the other things that Roosevelt does. And so the U.S. and the Spanish are in the process of mobilizing for this conflict. The Spanish decide to enter Cuba in a narrow harbor. And so the problem is they have to enter basically one ship at a time. And then they get tracked because the U.S. blockades them and is able to very quickly pick off their ships one at a time. And it really shows how Spain is a declining power, and the United States is on the rise. And again, we talked about how this is really the first time the United States has stepped out on the world stage. We're not the world power at this point that we are today, or even 30 years later, 25 years later with World War I. And so Cuba and the invasion of Cuba is given the nickname of a splendid little war. It's short. It starts April 11th and lasts until August 12th, 1898, when the armistice is signed. That's a typo. Let me see if I can't fix this cleanly. I hope you can still see my slide. If not, we'll put it back up there. So with the fighting, 400 troops die in actual battle from bullets from the Spanish, whereas 5,000 die from disease. And we acquire a lot of territory, and we'll talk about that with the next week's notes. But it's a short war, limited death count on the U.S. side, but there is a lot of territorial gain from the U.S. So that is it with the notes.